Hello, Jade and Betty and Midwest Milk Crew. I wanted to update you on where we are with electrolytes because we're continuing to see more and more success with them in the field, and our sales of electrolytes continue to really grow. I feel like we've really hit a high point on understanding all the research out there, having conducted some ourselves, but mostly just reviewing everything in the field. We actually hired, you could hire him before he went to work for Big Pharma. When he was at NC State, Jeff Smith, who was really is one of the leading minds on electrolyte therapy for the milk-fed calf. We had a very productive day with him. This was actually just right, the last trip Brunel and I made before COVID and hit. And he really got us headed in the right direction. We did some research at Mapleview Agri. That, of course, when you do that, you just learn a lot more. But more importantly, we've just engaged the market and seen success. We've done a lot of palatability work with Steve Denny, looking at all different kinds of formulas to increase palatability of electrolytes. I really feel like you've got a good opportunity, Jade, to have best in class for the two types of electrolytes. And I really believe there's two different types. There's one, a calf treatment product for a diarrhea calf. It needs to be an incredibly different formula compared to just one that you're going to feed every day at a low feeding rate that's going to drive fluid intake. And when you drive fluid intake, of course, not only do you keep the calf better hydrated during heat stress and maybe during mild scours or calf placement or just stressors that the calf faces during weaning, etc., but it also can drive grain intake. And I'm going to show you some research from Mapleview Agri that University of Vermont reviewed and collated and summarized. And it's really an interesting, I think, compelling story to show that how much fluid intake every week in 12 weeks of the calf's production from placement till their studies carry out to 12 weeks. Every single week, there was high correlation between grain intake and water intake, individual calf water intake. So I'll move into this data. And I do think it's a big opportunity for you in the calf ranch clientele or big dairies that you're calling on, Jade. I always like to start with why even the need. This Dr. Treffs, I've spoken with people who are working, who know Europeans or directly with some Europeans and calf researchers that report Dr. Treffs is quiet. He doesn't make the speaker circuit, but he's one of the best calf vets in Europe. And he publishes a ton of great research and kicks out a lot of great veterinarians. So never met him, but I sure like this paper. What he did was, his model is that when German growers would present calves to his teaching clinic, or when his students, I'm sure, were out in the field, when they saw moderately to severely diarrheic calves, they would assess them. They'd make a physical assessment and they would draw some blood and measure blood gas measures. And then they would have the grower report back 48 hours later, did the calf live or did the calf die? And then they could compare the blood gas measures of those that lived and those that died. And they could compare the physical parameters that they measured of those who lived and those who died and see what kind of differences there were. And what they found was that in regard to clinical signs, those that died had less of a suckling reflex. They were more depressed. They were recumbent. Their eyeballs were more recessed. They more frequently suffered from sepsis and hypothermia. Not a big surprise there. The lab findings he found was that in those calves that died, they had more severe blood acidemia, they had lower blood glucose levels, and they frequently had excessive sodium. I call those the three grim reapers of death in diarrheic calves: acidemia, low blood glucose, and excessive sodium. And I would argue that an electrolyte product and treatment strategy needs to address those three things. So let's look at these. The first one, correcting blood acidemia. If you look off to the bottom right, the venous blood levels, the blood pH of the survivors and the non-survivors numerically really aren't that different. But note that even that minor difference found a p less than 0.05 value. So you really must correct blood acidemia. There's an old study that's excellent that was done in Canada where the calves were induced and suffered from diarrhea associated with that inducement of rotavirus and coronavirus. They had copious watery feces, and the calves were either treated with an electrolyte with no blood buffer, or one with sodium bicarbonate as the blood buffer, or sodium acetate as the blood buffer. And you can see the recovery rates were significantly higher and comparable whether you used bicarb or sodium acetate. And we found in our research that we have published in the Journal of Dairy Science, we compared one based on mostly bicarb or one based entirely on sodium acetate, and we found that both corrected blood acidemia comparably. I think it's also interesting to note that sodium acetate containing electrolyte in a Purdue study published in the Journal of Dairy Science performed comparably to what I've always considered to be the gold standard in treating a diarrheic calf, and that's hitting it with lactated ringer solution. This Purdue study, that was their comparison, was the sodium acetate containing electrolyte or applying just intravenous application of lactated ringers. And they found that blood acidemia and blood glucose were better corrected with the sodium acetate containing electrolyte as compared to the ringer. And maybe that's not so surprising because ringers really aren't formulated to correct those two things. But ringers are designed to replace plasma volume as rapidly as you possibly can. And that in fact did occur. They had more rapid plasma refluidation with the ringer compared to the acetate containing sodium electrolyte, but it really wasn't too much further behind. It did a nice job of correcting that loss of fluids. So one could argue in that study that the ringer did a far better job than, that the sodium acetate containing electrolyte did a better job than an IV or subcutaneous administered ringer. One concern when dealing with electrolytes is that you want to maintain that natural barrier of a low pH in the abomasum that just naturally kills Salmonella and E. coli. As we all know, calves are constantly getting manure meals because they like to explore the environment they're in. They like to clean themselves. They'll interact with their neighbors, or if they're housed in group housing with each other, and get a lot of manure meals every day. And so we know that E. coli can't proliferate in a pH above 5, and Salmonella can't, or below 5, and Salmonella can't proliferate in a pH below 5.5. So you ideally want to keep that natural low abomasal pH low as much of the day as possible. Dr. Jeff Smith, who I would argue is one of the leading minds in the world on electrolytes for the milk-fed calf, Ronell and I went to NC State and hired him for a day just to get a day of his time when he was there. He's now moved on to working for one of the big pharma companies. But he really got our mind going in the right direction in a lot of these electrolyte concepts. And we shared papers just to make sure we were fully up to speed with all the data that was out there at the time. And he even was on our JDS article as far as putting the research, reporting the research and designing the study. But Smith did a foundational study looking at electrolytes and how they impact abomasal pH and keeping it below that 5.5 level to prevent Salmonella from proliferating. And he found that if you use an electrolyte based on sodium acetate, about 10% of the day you're going to have a pH above 5.5 because of that electrolyte therapy. But if you use one based on bicarb, these were just a couple of commercial products he could readily get that he used in the study, but they were 35 to almost 44% of the day you had a pH above 5.5. So that bicarb is really having a big impact on the abomasal pH. Now, of course, just feeding milk replacer, just feeding the calf, you're going to result in about a fifth of the day being above 5.5. But you would want your electrolyte strategy in a diarrheic calf, one that's already got a lot of immunological compromise going on. You'd want to make sure that you use that tool of that abomasal pH being low as much of the time as possible so that that door isn't open for that manure meal to land in the gut, land in the small intestine instead of being killed, the Salmonella in it being killed in the abomasum. This is some work that Mike Ballou's lab did at Texas Tech. It's just showing the same thing, only he also compared it with and without milk replacer. And I'd bore you to tears if I went through this, but if you're interested in it, you can stop and read this slide. But maybe more importantly, what Ballou did at Texas Tech is he pulled abomasal fluid out of each of these treatment groups. One with bicarb-based electrolyte, one with sodium acetate containing electrolyte, and both of them either with or without milk replacer being fed. And he found that there was greater E. coli proliferation in the abomasal fluid from the calf that received the sodium bicarb-based electrolyte, which of course, what we now know is because the pH was greater in that abomasal fluid from the calf that received the bicarb-based electrolyte. So in summary, both are equally effective in correcting blood acidemia, whether it be sodium acetate or sodium bicarbonate. And that's exactly what we found in our study that we published in JDS too. Sodium bicarb has an advantage in being less expensive, and it's infinitely easier to work with as a manufacturer of the electrolyte, not causing any kicking, lumping. I'm going to show you some pictures of some of the rubbish we created in our learning curve to figure out how to work with sodium acetate in an electrolyte. Sodium acetate has the benefit of being metabolized in the liver, so you've got far less of the 24-hour period that abomasal pH is going to be above 5.5. And that's a benefit in naturally killing pathogens like Salmonella and E. coli when it hits that low pH environment before it can ever get into the GI tract. Now, this second grim reaper of death, increasing blood glucose, the group from Treff's study in Germany that died had a much lower blood glucose level. You can see it in the bottom right hand there compared to those that survived. So our electrolyte therapy really needs to get that calf up. I oftentimes think of caring for my dad at the end of his life. I'd visit him at the nursing home, and he was I don't need to get into all the parameters, but he was at the end of his life in his final months and years. And oftentimes his mind was all there, but sometimes I'd come and he would just be listless. And if we got him a glass of orange juice or Coke and he drank it, it was amazing to me how he could perk up really quickly and I could have a conversation with him. And so that's a human being. I think in the calf, we can definitely see it in whether they're going to be getting up and hitting the buckets well, drinking their electrolytes, or whether they're going to look like this calf in the picture. And a lot of it has to do with low blood glucose levels. But when you raise blood glucose feeding dextrose, you also raise osmolarity. And osmolarity, if, I think we've gone through this a lot in the past with you guys have looked at this deeply in the osmolarity of your milk replacers. But so that blood and whole milk, they're right equally both at around 300 milliosmoles per liter. And that's why whole milk is rapidly absorbed. And when the calf drinks, of course, distilled water has zero osmolarity, so it gets rapidly absorbed when it hits the gut, and it's going to go across that brush border and rehydrate the blood. But when you start adding dextrose to an electrolyte, you're going to raise the osmolarity up to around 400 or to maybe as high as 600. And, it's not that a calf wouldn't benefit from the electrolyte that contains 600 milliosmoles per liter, but if it was fed or administered via an esophageal feeder to a calf that was profoundly dehydrated, you could literally kill that calf because fluids would rapidly be pulled out of the bloodstream to correct that high osmolarity and get it down to 300 so it could be absorbed. And that's why it'd be ideal if you're isotonic. But on the other hand, at 300 milliosmoles per liter. But on the other hand, we have to raise blood glucose, and the only way to do that is to have a higher osmolarity electrolyte. That's why I like to go with around 400 to 500 milliosmoles per liter, because then you're striking that balance of having something isotonic that's going to be rapidly absorbed, or closer to it, but yet something with enough glucose to raise blood glucose levels. This third grim reaper of death, the one that surprised me, was that a lot of these calves are dying from sodium toxicity. And you can see the differences in average blood sodium levels in the bottom right from Treff's study. Now, sodium, there's no doubt about it in a diarrheic calf. It's essential. And sodium's in blood and fluids around cells. This is from the Merck manual. They help keep normal blood fluids in a good balance. They're critical for nerve and muscle function. And sodium, you've got to have it around blood and around cells. But hypernatremia, sodium toxicity, is also a concern. And you can read these things. Calves are going to get severely depressed and lethargic in a severe case. Janis always reported, when he was strictly a veal nutritionist early in his career, that it wasn't uncommon before they understood the appropriate whey sources to use that were low in sodium to have hypernatremia. And it started with just calves having, they had the squirts like a garden hose. And he said that was its first sign. They were still on feed. They were healthy. They weren't diarrheic from bacteria, any kind of infection. They were diarrheic from sodium toxicity. And that's how it manifests itself originally. So you could stop and look at this. Again, I'm going to bore you to tears if I just go through this. But you can see the routine sodium intake in the top box. I will point out that Fisher et al. Study is a beauty from 1972. This researcher captured all the fecal material in diarrheic calves and captured all the fecal material in healthy ones. And he found that there was a profound difference in the diarrheic ones. They were squirting out a lot of sodium. Obviously, that sodium has to be replaced. So I'm bringing up all this just to reiterate that sodium in a treatment type electrolyte needs to be at a high level. You have to correct that sodium loss. And this just goes through a little bit more on sodium intake, which you can review on your own. But I always like to recommend in a treatment type electrolyte that has enough sodium to correct these sodium losses that you feed 1 or 2 doses daily. These are going to typically be a 4-ounce dose because they're going to have enough dextrose to really raise blood glucose levels. But feed it until the calf turns around, and the diarrhea is starting to subside and end, and then stop. Quit them. And if you don't stop it within 3 days, then stop it anyway, because it's beyond what an electrolyte's going to do. Maybe go to the second type of electrolyte that's really low in sodium and really just designed to provide some dextrose and get them to drink more fluids. But if you don't do that, I think you do risk exacerbating this concern of hypernatremia. There's really, I would argue, 2 different types of electrolytes. One is a preventive strategy. This is a product that's typically fed an ounce in 2 quarts or something like that. It's going to be made of dextrose, a very low level of blood buffers, a very low level. You don't want high levels of electrolytes. But you definitely need to have, we have some palatant packages, sweeteners and flavors that really are proven to drive fluid intake. And to me, that's the big reason to use them, is to get the calf better hydrated for when it's going through heat stress, when it's meeting really any kind of stress, including moderate diarrhea or transport stress or stress of weaning, but also to drive fluid intake. And then a second type of electrolyte that you're going to be using way less of, that's designed to be administered to diarrheic calves. And if they're properly formulated, hopefully you get good voluntary intake. But if you can't get them to consume them, then they really should be tubed with an esophageal feeder. And then, of course, the last type of therapy is going to be a ringer. And those can, as we all know, pull calves from the jaws of death. But I've also heard the same with some of these treatment type electrolytes when you tube them. So I think both have those capabilities, but I would not hesitate. You still need to advocate using ringers, but you're going to use a lot fewer ringers, and all the hassles associated with administering those ringers are going to be less frequent if you have a good treatment type electrolyte. And I would argue maybe even too if you have a good preventative type electrolyte, because when that calf goes into its diarrheic event, it's going to go into it being kind of topped off in fluid intake. This basic inexpensive one, this is some research we did at Steve Denny's, one of the last veal growers left standing in Wisconsin. We provided him with an unmarked bag of electrolytes, told him how to administer it, And then every other calf in his barn received either this plain water, fed at the same temperature, at the calf's body temperature. This was fed midday, I think at like 11 o'clock or noon. He feeds calves. At that time, he was feeding them sometime like between 5 and 6, and then again at between 4 and 5 p.m. So this would be midday, getting 2 quarts of either an electrolyte with just this 1 ounce, 25 grams in 2 quarts, or plain water. And you could see, then he would come back an hour later and he'd eyeball the bowl in front of that calf, whether the calf consumed it all, 3/4, half, a quarter, or none, and wrote that down. And then I could attach that and do statistics on it. And the bottom line was that the electrolyte resulted in a 30% improvement in fluid intake, a 30% improvement in voluntary fluid intake. That's pretty remarkable. Note that 100% of the calves consuming 100% of what was put in front of them occurred in 77% of the instances on average when the electrolyte was in there, versus just a little bit over half when offered plain water. And of the calves that didn't consume any, 25% of the calves were offered plain water didn't consume any of it, versus just 11% of the calves that were offered the electrolyte. This needs to have just a maintenance level of the key electrolytes. In fact, you wouldn't even want to dream of putting them in there at a high rate because you'd be causing hypernatremia. We put in just a low level of blood buffer. We don't put bicarb in there. We use sodium citrate. It's a lot like sodium acetate, and really at a very low level. And then the balance of it is going to be mostly dextrose. So that's going to raise blood glucose, which I would argue could maybe make the calf a little more active and possibly consume more grain. You could put in a little bit of extra glycine. It would enhance uptake of glucose and sodium. B vitamins would be a logical thing that are very inexpensive and shown to stimulate appetite and immune function. And of course, we're going to make these things water dispersible and highly free flowing. But our key reason to use these is to promote fluid intake. But it would also be nominally replacing lost electrolytes, associated with heat stress or mild diarrhea, and provide some base level of glucose, and obviously with a goal to minimizing dehydration. These are important for water intake during heat stress and also to improve grain intake. And I think I want to focus a bit on this water intake and how critical it is for grain intake. Mapleview Agra is where we do research. It's a milk replacer company in Ontario. They have some affiliation with the University of Guelph because of the head of the veterinary department, Dave Vernal, is the person who sets up all their studies with them and does all the stats. But they worked with the University of Vermont. João Costa is doing a really nice job there as a calf-focused researcher. And he just looked at all the data because Mapleview, and I'll show this next slide, if you look on the left, they on each calf can measure, they offer water both in a cup and a nipple, and they have meters on there so they can record daily how much water intake that calf is receiving via those two methods. They have beautiful grain. Every time I've been there, it looks like what these pictures look like, and you can see the design of their research barn. But with this individual water intake, and then they're already measuring weekly group grain intake, so they know by week what individual on average grain intake calves had. These researchers, the research team at the University of Vermont, chugged all this data, and the results were on 346 calves that the calves consumed on average 363.8 liters, and they consumed about 151 kilos of grain over the 84-day or 12-week period of the studies that they were in. But here's the cool part. Every extra liter of water that was consumed over that 12-week or 84-day period resulted in over a half a pound of extra grain intake. So think about that. If we increased water intake just 10 liters, then that's going to be about 5 pounds of extra average daily gain, or 5 pounds of extra grain intake. So this could be pretty profound if we could get some nice increases in water intake by feeding an electrolyte. And not only, this is data from the same set of research at Mapleview Agra, data chugged by University of Vermont, but they looked at it by week. in the 12-week period. And every week except week 1, they saw high correlation, p-values of 0.01 or even p less than 0.001 of more water intake, resulting in more grain intake. And even on week 1, where there's just nominal, just 20 grams of grain intake, they found a trend. I think the other thing to consider is how much water the calf loses during heat stress. And Jim Quigley recently reviewed an old but good study where they had chambers that they put these calves in, and they could keep temperature and humidity precise for 24-hour periods. I can't recall exactly how they did this, but they could measure water loss from respiring and from sweating. And they found that the combined losses associated from more respiring and more sweating in a 95-degree temperature, versus a 68 one was about an extra 5 liters a day, which is profound. So when we're going through the heat stress that's commonly seen, in these calves, during the summertime, particularly in the south, and in the areas where you're selling a lot of milk replacer, Jade, you're probably seeing an extra 5 liters a day in fluid loss. So it could really help that calf if we could drive more fluid intake. Again, this inexpensive electrolyte, this 25 gram and 2 quarts, I would offer it to every calf, certainly during hot weather, and maybe around the year as a midday bottle. And I would also offer it as maybe twice a day during routine scour periods, maybe during weaning, maybe upon transport for a number of days when they arrive, if it's a calf ranch, or maybe even the first few days, after they're being placed. We wouldn't, of course, put any type of electrolyte in milk or milk replacer solution, and I would continue to offer plain water before and after this electrolyte. But your goal is to just hydrate, and your cost on this, this is your cost, not including your margin you're going to attach onto it, is going to be about 10 cents per calf per 1 ounce dose. So it's also incredibly cost effective. The treatment type electrolyte, we need to have a blood buffer level of around 50 milliosmoles per liter. There needs to be enough to do the job. I haven't brought this up yet in this presentation, but balancing for strong ion difference is also critical. And this is where having these appropriate blood buffers makes a huge difference. There's Purdue research to show that if you do this, and this is managing anions and cations, it's chemistry well beyond my understanding, but I do know what that number needs to be, and it needs to be a strong ion difference of around 70 to 75, that area 80. And if you do that, the research shows that also corrects blood acidemia. We need to have enough glucose in there to raise blood glucose levels, meaning we need to have a 4 ounce dose, and some of it should come from dextrose. We want it to be modestly hypertonic. I would say no more than around 470, 500 milliosmoles per liter. Maybe more ideally, a little bit less than that. But glucose, although it's necessary, it does raise osmolarity. So you want to have enough of it to do the job, but yet not too much to potentially cause some problems with osmolarity being too high. We like to make these treatment type electrolytes with fairly high levels of glycine because there's some human research in one calf study to show that you get better glucose absorption and better sodium uptake if you have glycine in there. I think it's logical to put some of our calf-specific bacillus in there. They were selected to kill Clostridium E. coli and Salmonella isolated in feces from scouring calves in a petri dish. And these bacillus were also proven in large controlled studies to reduce scours and med costs. But I think the lowest hanging fruit sort of way to use them is to put them in electrolytes, because there was one study, and this is very, very nominal in cost too. It's almost inconsequential in your electrolyte strategy to incorporate them. But by incorporating them in that treatment type electrolyte and just feeding the calf for 2 feedings, it improved weight gain during the scour period, it reduced Clostridium shedding, and it reduced med costs and lactated ringer use. And it also improved immune function. So these products, these high sodium acetate type electrolytes, I would mix them at 4 ounces and 2 quarts of electrolyte solution. I would feed them at calf body temperature several hours after the milk feeding once or twice a day. And I would offer them, and you'll get a lot of voluntary consumption. We've proven that also. I think this data is in here, hopefully in the coming slides, but we found that same effect to be even more profound in these diarrheic calves, that if we have that flavor and sweetener in there, plus the dextrose, that we can have a really dramatic effect versus almost doubling the voluntary intake versus plain water. But if they aren't consumed, I think these diarrheic calves, if calf caregivers can do it without putting it down the wrong tube, causing asphyxiation, or also just not spreading disease, if they make sure and do it in a hygienic way. If they can do that, I like to have them administer electrolytes that aren't consumed. And we always would offer or suggest offering plain water after the electrolytes are consumed. Here's the intake studies. We did one. You can see the voluntary consumption after 1 hour was a lot greater versus plain water. And Mapleview Agri did it as well, and even saw a more profound impact in the slide in the bottom. Nobody likes the Tubicaf, and so we want to make these as palatable as possible. This is the mess we created out in California in August, September, one year, a number of years ago, when we didn't know what we were doing. The electrolyte looked like the powder in the middle, a nice white free-flowing powder. But after being exposed to temperatures that were well above 100 and were sustained, I think over 90 or 100 in the warehouse 24/7, it starts out looking like what it is on the left, and it can even, in this extreme case, turn into the product on the right. This all prompted us to invest in a hot box so we could play with formulas, create that desert climate 24/7 in a hot box. And we created a lot of the mush on the left, and even some, I don't think we ever created anything quite on the right in our lab, but we played around with formulas, played around with sugar sources, played around with different ingredients. And we know that we can create a product like what's in the center, and a year from now, it'll look like the product in the center. So you can buy these products knowing you're not going to create that mess. That's a huge difference. It's one of the most humiliating experiences I had in sales and in my entire career. So the bottom line is, we really suggest a 2 electrolyte strategy. We can formulate one that kind of tries to bridge both sides, but it really isn't ideal for either. The preventative electrolyte is really to drive fluid intake and then result in helping the calf get through heat stress better and to drive grain intake. And the scour treatment type strategy is designed to be more of a 3 or certainly hopefully a 4 ounce in 2 quart type product with adequate dextrose to raise blood glucose, but yet not so high that osmolarity is too high, with a correct blood buffer at an adequate level to correct blood acidemia, using and advocating a strategy that doesn't overfeed electrolytes and cause hypernatremia. Both need to be really palatable, they need to be shelf stable and cost effective. And I think that's what we can really do. Thanks for your time.